second time in his career, Morgan rushed to Washington to see the president. In a meeting at the White House, Morgan protested to Roosevelt that he should have been given a chance to restructure Northern Securities himself. "That is just what we did not want you to do," the president replied. "If we have done anything wrong," said Morgan, "send your man to my man and they can fix it up." "That can't be done," Roosevelt said. The Attorney General added, "We don't want to fix it. We want to stop it." Morgan was furious. No politician would tell J. Pierpont Morgan how to run his business. Morgan went to the courts and fought the breakup of his company, but the decision was upheld by the Supreme Court. Northern Securities was officially dissolved.
Pierpont Morgan resented Theodore Roosevelt, finally. And once when he heard that Roosevelt was going off to Africa on a safari, Morgan said, "Good, I hope the first lion that meets him does his duty."
Morgan knew he had been beaten, but he wasn't about to give up. He was still powerful and just as determined to control and influence events as ever. Despite their father's frequent absences and his immersion in business affairs, Morgan's children were successful and well established in their personal lives. Morgan delighted in his grandchildren. His gruff demeanor softened when he was around them. With his children on their own, Morgan had more time to pursue his travels and his collecting. But his purchases had outgrown his house. So he decided that he would have a library built to display his treasures. He spared no expense.
That a building of this magnitude would be built as a private library for a private person in New York was an extraordinary thing.
Morgan also gave enormous amounts of money away. In addition to his numerous charities, he gave close to $2 million to build monuments to his father at Harvard University and the Wadsworth Athenaeum, a museum in his hometown of Hartford. It was in his new library, however, that Morgan would achieve his final crowning glory. In the fall of 1907, another panic hit Wall Street. One of America's largest trust companies had collapsed, sending shockwaves throughout the American economy. In Washington, President Roosevelt saw political disaster loom large. Immediate action was required, and Roosevelt's advisors knew that there was only one man with the power to save the nation. The president who had prosecuted Morgan for having too much control was about to hand that control back to him. Roosevelt sent the Secretary of the Treasury to New York with $25 million in government funds to be placed at Morgan's disposal. Morgan used the money strategically and bought the national economy some time. But there was more work to be done. The public was in a panic. Trusts were continuing to fail as people rushed to withdraw their money. The situation looked desperate, but Morgan had a plan. He reasoned that by rescuing the failing trust, it might reverse the downturn and restore public confidence. He knew the answer was to get the larger trusts to invest money in their weaker competitors. This wasn't easy, but Morgan's powers of persuasion were unmatched. He gathered the trust company presidents in his study in the library beneath the gaze of his statues of saints and Madonnas. He cast a long, penetrating look at each man and launched into a plea for cooperation that at times sounded like a command. He left the presidents to debate the merits of the plan. Morgan then walked to the front door of the library, locked it, and removed the key. He retired to another room and played solitaire, waiting for a solution. Hours passed, and still the men could not agree on Morgan's plan. But they would agree eventually. Morgan had locked them in. No matter what it took, the bankers would see things Morgan's way, or they'd stay in his library forever. With the entire economy in peril, the nation's most influential men were locked in Pierpont Morgan's library. All night, they tried in vain to work out a solution to the financial crisis. Throughout the night, the bankers went to Morgan with compromises or other suggestions.
and he would be sitting at the desk and he would be flipping his cards. And one of his lieutenants would come in and say, Mr. Morgan, the bank presidents have proposed a $10 million loan. And he would be flipping his cards and he would look up and he would say, it's not enough. Flip his cards again.
In the early hours of the morning, Morgan marched into the study. The men still had not come to a solution, but Morgan had. He pushed a contract drawn up by his partners and a pen into the hand of the leader of the trust company presidents. He pointed to the contract and said, here's the place and here's the pen. Completely exhausted and beaten down, the president signed and the others followed. The trusts had agreed to contribute to the $25 million pool. Within days, the economy rallied. Morgan's return to Wall Street during the Panic of 1907 signaled the last time that the United States would allow a banker to control the nation's resources the way Morgan had. Soon, the federal government set up formal agencies to do what Morgan had done single-handedly, protect the national economy.
Prior to 1913, we did not have a Federal Reserve Board in this country. We had J. Pierpont Morgan. He was like a one-man central bank.
Shortly after the crisis of 1907, Morgan went into semi-retirement. He was tired. Now in his 70s, he spent time traveling and collecting art. In the United States, the debate over Morgan's influence continued. Public opinion turned firmly against big business. In 1912, a Senate committee was set up to investigate what they termed the money trusts on Wall Street. Morgan was ordered to appear in Washington in December. Samuel Untermeyer, an affluent New York City trial lawyer, asked the questions for the committee. Morgan was grilled for hours, but in one line of questioning, he was able to redeem his actions in the eyes of a wary public. Untermeyer asked Morgan, is not commercial credit based primarily upon money or property? Morgan answered, no, sir. The first thing is character. Before money or property, Untermeyer countered. Before money or anything else, Morgan replied. Money cannot buy it because a man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. Spectators applauded. Morgan had stated the banking philosophy on which he had built his empire. But his reign as the emperor of American finance was over. The country embraced the 20th century. The banking world moved forward without Pierpont Morgan. As soon as the hearings were over, Morgan returned to his travels. But Pierpont Morgan's time ran out. On March 31st, 1913, he died in his sleep in a hotel in Rome. He was 75. Thousands of people flocked to St. George's Church for Pierpont Morgan's funeral. His body was taken to Hartford, where he was buried in the family plot. As a final tribute, the New York Stock Exchange stayed closed that morning, one of the few times in its history. Upon his death, Morgan's personal fortune was estimated at over $68 million. His art collection alone was worth another $60 million. His wife Fanny lived well into her 80s, dying in the home she shared with her husband. Morgan's son Jack took control of J.P. Morgan and Company, which held control over banking and other institutions with assets of over $2 billion. The firm still exists today. Morgan left his greatest treasure, his art collection, to the American people. Many of his works were donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Wadsworth Athenaeum. The Pierpont Morgan Library, opened to the public in 1924, stands as a beautiful monument to the awesome power that one man was able to amass in the course of a lifetime.
In a way, Pierpont Morgan is our Napoleon. We're fascinated by him. We're fascinated by his sense of control over his environment. We're fascinated by his successes. We're even more fascinated by his failures and his escapes.
After Morgan's death, his once bitter rival Theodore Roosevelt summed up Morgan's life. Mr. Morgan was politically opposed to me, yet whenever I was brought into contact with him, I was struck not only by his very great power, but by his sincerity and truthfulness. J. Pierpont Morgan used his integrity and his influence to transform Wall Street at the turn of the century. In the process, he changed America forever.